I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like at I Mix What I Like for all your relevant social media. And of course, imixwhatilike.org, where you can get all that the crew puts together and more whenever you want, all the time. You know, for those of us like my next guest who have come through the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University, the Hoyt Fuller Room is the central hub within that space and has been host to an infinite number of classes, gatherings, and ceremonies like the one we've just left commemorating that center's founder, Dr. James Turner. And yet the man, Hoyt Fuller, exists for most in eponym only, but not for our next guest, whose brilliance is only matched by his resistance over the years to join me on this platform, Dr. Jonathan Fenderson, who is an assistant professor of African and African American studies at Washington University in St. Louis and has written a fascinating and equally brilliant new book, which compels this long-awaited visit, titled Building the Black Arts Movement, Hoyt Fuller and the Cultural Politics of the 1960s, just out on University of Illinois Press. Dr. Fenderson, my man, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining me.
Appreciate you, Jared. Appreciate you, man. And I should say, man, I never avoided this show, man. I always felt like I needed a substantial body of work to come on before, you know, so that's all it was, man.
Yeah. Well, whatever. No, you've produced a substantial body of work, and I'm honored to say that our previous radio show was even in part subject of some of that scholarship, or involved in the writing that you produce. So we appreciate that as well. And I'm very happy, man. I'm very excited to have been reading this new book, and I have a whole bunch of questions and some other things that I want to ask you about, including, and I want to come to this in a moment, sort of a quick update in response from you from Ferguson, knowing that you've not only been there, but were also instrumental in the streets and the activism there. So I thought we could quickly revisit that. But I wanted to start with this book, again, Building the Black Arts Movement, Hoyt Fuller and the Cultural Politics of the 1960s. I wanted to ask you, you had a line about Fuller that, again, you know, we spent so much time in the Africana Studies and Research Center in the Hoyt Fuller Room. His for a long time, at least for many of us, that beautiful painting of him was up on the wall. But honestly, a lot of us never took the time to actually study the man or enough of him or his role in as you put it, the Black Arts Movement and beyond. And then recently, of course, we saw that the magazine that he was instrumental in well, sort of the path in developing and in the umbrella organization that he worked, the Johnson Company organization, going bankrupt, and over the years, Ebony and Jet being sold off, and all of these other things. I thought this was just another perfect time to talk about it. So I'll find the quote I'm looking for in just a minute, but let me have you just start with an overview of what your book is about, and who Hoyt Fuller was and what his role in all of this was and should be understood to be.
Yeah, man. So, you know, this book is, Hoyt Fuller is the central character in this book, but essentially what the book is trying to do is tell a kind of series of institutional histories. And these are all institutions, Black institutions that he was a part of. And so what I try to do is use his life as a kind of window into understanding the institutional development, both the rise and decline of the Black Arts Movement. And so it's interesting because Hoyt Fuller has been a name that we hear all the time when we talk about the Black Arts Movement, particularly because he edited Negro Digest. And also he wrote the essay Toward a Black Aesthetic. But in terms of who he really is, we never get a sense of that. And so what I want to do is kind of do two things. Was the one, tell an institutional history of the Black Arts Movement, but also give a more complete picture of who actually Hoyt Fuller was. And in doing that, I also was trying to show that all social movements have people who are out front on the stage, but then they also have people who are stage builders. And Hoyt Fuller was one of those stage builders. And so I was trying to do a couple of things with the book. I'm not quite sure I was effective at doing both, but that was kind of what I was shooting for.
Well, far be it from me to suggest you didn't, and we'll let more. We'll have to let folks with greater expertise on this history come out and show any shortcomings here, because from my vantage point, what you've done here is pretty exceptional. And you describe Hoyt Fuller as a central figure to the Black Arts movement. You describe him as an architect. You use the word architect in describing him. You talk about the Black militant kabuki theater that he orchestrated in terms of the creation of outside agitation from within to propel his own institution to move more closely to the politics that he was adopting. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. I guess starting with the macro, I guess this broad relationship that you do talk about between the Black Arts movement and the Black power struggle, the Black liberation struggle, more broadly speaking, or the relationship between art and politics, and then where Fuller himself saw himself situated within that relationship, or how he deployed or engaged that relationship between art and politics.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think Hoyt Fuller was somebody who, he's not a frontline Black power activist in the same way you would think of somebody like Huey Newton or Malcolm X, but he's a professional in the traditional sense. I mean, he's somebody who has a solid career in a 9-to-5 in a Black company. He sees himself as an editor and a writer first and foremost, but his politics essentially align with Black power. And so even early on, like at the Black Power Conference in Newark, he's trying to figure out a way to tie Black power to Black professionals. And so it's kind of an interesting contradiction, because on the one hand, Black power, a lot of Black power advocates are calling for liberation. Many are calling for revolution. And then Hoyt Fuller is also somebody who's trying to kind of advocate for Black people who are working as professionals. So it's kind of an inherent contradiction, and I try to carry that contradiction throughout the entire book. But I think that he's somebody who aligns much more with the third world. He aligns with African independence. He's somebody who's making trips back and forth. He's really somebody who's committed to Pan-Africanism. And so that's part of the tension that lies in the book, because he's working for somebody who doesn't necessarily agree with those things, or only falls in line with those things when it's his economic advantage. And that person I'm talking about specifically is John Johnson. And so he kind of operates in this weird position where he has one foot in this kind of lean towards Black liberation and radical politics, and then one foot in this professional, class of Black people. But what's interesting is that he's one of these people who uses the resources and the institutional access that he has to further movement. And so he's always attempting to bring in radical people into the conversation. He's always attempting to kind of demonstrate a more left side of Black politics. And I mean, it's in a lot of ways similar to what you do, Jared, in terms of making sure that you're always raising up Black left voices. And I think Hoyt Fuller was committed to that. And so that's kind of the tension that plays throughout the book. And it even plays out in his notions of a Black aesthetic. And what I try to show is that project of trying to always raise up Black left voices oftentimes creates space, but the people who create that space don't get a chance to actually inhabit that space. They're pushed out and replaced by new people who don't have the same left politics. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with it.
Oh, absolutely. And I definitely want to come back to that point you just raised about the replacement of that's it, the replacement element that you talk about, that you actually bring up in your book. I think, wonderfully reminding many of us. Anyway, I'm going to come back to that in just a second, but you actually conclude your book by saying, within the new reality, a paradox has emerged whereby ever-expanding notions of cultural politics as the central arena of struggle have continued to wax, and genuine connections to transnational power struggles over the mechanisms of governance and the distribution of rights and resources have waned on the part of African Americans, end quote. And I mean, on the one hand, now feel free to correct me. On the one hand, I fully agree with that, and want to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit, because I definitely wanted to ask, as I was reading, I was thinking I want to ask him about what does Hoyt Fuller's examples say to the moment now in this relationship between art and politics. And then I finally got to the end and read that line that you conclude the book with. And I wanted you to elaborate on that a little bit, this waxing and waning, the relationship again, you know, because anyway, so I was glad to, and on the other hand, I was happy to read that, because it to me is a more honest ending point that doesn't, and what I think happens a lot, you know, kind of falsely speak to an optimism that doesn't exist. But you leave us with, I think, a very honest assessment of where we are. So anyway, could you please elaborate on this waxing and waning in the cultural versus, as you say, the genuine connections to transnational power struggles?
Absolutely. I mean, so one of the things that a lot of Black art scholars have attempted to do is to show how the Black arts movement still kind of continues on, and there's all these remnants of it. And that I fundamentally agree with, that there you can see traces of the Black arts movement in hip hop and in contemporary literature, all these things. But I think what's interesting is that we live in a moment where everybody's talking about cultural politics. You know, if you go on Twitter, everyone's debating the latest Black film. If you get on the internet, everybody's talking about, you know, who produced this movie, or who is misrepresented in this, or how this character is shown. And what's fascinating is that there's all these debates around culture and representation of Blackness in culture. But those debates, they don't actually get at the core of the mechanisms that impacted our lives. And so and it's a weird moment. And I wrote this post-Ferguson. I wrote that line post-Ferguson because it seems to me that we're so fascinated with cultural politics that we've actually forgotten to talk about politics proper, and actually forgotten to engage the state in a certain way. And also the ideas of like a kind of broader Black world are beginning to slip from us as well. I mean, very few of us know anything about any of the countries in Africa and what's happening in those places, the kinds of regime changes and struggles that are taking place. And what's fascinating about the 60s is that people didn't just know what was happening in the US. They knew what was happening in all these different places around the world, and saw or tried to imagine ways to impact what was happening in these other places. And it's funny because it seems as the world is getting smaller, we have so much information and technology at our fingertips, but yet our politics have become so emaciated. And so that's what I was kind of trying to allude to at the end of the book. I mean, in the 1960s, people were talking about a Pan-African world and keeping up with what was happening in Tanzania, in Jamaica, in Canada. I mean, people were reading all this stuff, and yet we're at this moment where we're not reading any of it, don't know any of it, but yet we're fascinated by this kind of, popular media, or not even popular media, but we're fascinated by popular culture. And so this is, I mean, it's a weird and interesting contradiction that we're in, or paradox that we're in. And that's one of the things I think we have to figure out.
Well, and I don't know if you thought of it this way, or if, again, I'm projecting my own bias here. And again, you know, so again, correct me if necessary. But what I see is leading us to your, and I agree with what you just said, but what I see is or helping us get to this point has been what you talk about. And I said we were going to revisit this. I was struggling for what to call it, but as you call it in the section in your book, Reconstruction, Professional Criticism and the Rise of New Architects. You know, this, you talk about, in effect, the convergence of popular media and, as you put it, a reconstructionist endeavor to, as you say here, to quote, rescue African-American literature and its critique and discussion from the Black arts movement crowd. And you talk specifically about Henry Louis Gates Jr., who, you know, for me, I picked up my sort of indirect engagement with him studying John Henrik Clarke, who comes a generation Yeah, about it at a point, maybe a generation and a half after the point you pick him up. So in other words, you bring it back and extend it farther than and I think many of us thought to do or knew to do. By showing that Gates comes out of a crowd that is meant, and as he does, and you point out, specifically replace Hoyt Fuller and the like in discussion of Black art, Black politics, Black history. And then I'll just add here and ask you to respond that Gates then becomes the popular media spokesperson for Black for Black art, for Black politics, which I think is correlated to the devolution of the radicalism and the organization and the social movement. Not that he, of course, created that whole, but he represents part of that, so that the popular discussion of Blackness is so limited in terms of scope and geography and ideology, that the politics are impacted in such a way that reflect that same thing, and vice versa, to end us in this moment that I think you so perfectly described. So I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about Gates, who again is in popular media, and what you were talking about that he was part of in this Reconstructionist effort, and then responding to anything else that I've just said there, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. It's interesting, Jared. And last time we saw each other in Ithaca, we were talking about. I mentioned to you sometimes, people need to write with a clear agenda and also like they have an opposition. And what's fascinating is when I was writing this book, I really started to understand the nature of vanguards, and it's also as a result of my experiences in Ferguson. Is that vanguards. We always, we praise vanguards. Everyone wants to be in the vanguard. But the fascinating thing about vanguards is that they oftentimes don't get a chance to live to see the world that they create. And so I think that's what happened essentially with a lot of the Black arts figures. They opened up this incredibly amazing space that was, a place where like politics and arts and cultural questions all collided. And then after opening up this space, they don't actually get to inhabit it. So you think of people like Hoyt Fuller, like Larry Neal, who were extremely important in terms of the kind of Black cultural analysis that they were bringing in, the conversations that they were a part of. But yet they don't necessarily get to maintain that space and cultivate it over the years. And what ends up happening is you have another generation or a younger group of people who are positioned to take up that space. And I think that's what we saw with Henry Louis Gates, is that he is somebody who's in school and finishing. He's pedigreed. He is in the Modern Language Association. So he's positioned in a way to really take up the conversation that Hoyt Fuller and other people started. And what's interesting, particularly with Henry Louis Gates, is that he also is very clearly anti-nationalist. He's also very clearly anti-Black arts. And there's this letter I found in the Schoenberg where he's writing to Larry Neal, and he talks about how he thinks the Black arts movement is thoroughly sexist and thoroughly racist. And so he's opposed to it. But what's fascinating is that as his clout grows, so too does that narrative of the Black arts movement, right? And so what I try to show at the end of the book is not only where that narrative kind of emanates from, but also the fact that the kind of evidence that he had always used to support that argument are fundamentally flawed. And so I think what's fascinating is that there are always going to be people who are in a position to access spaces that are opened up by social movements. But the challenge is finding people who are also committed to the politics of those social movements. And when you look at the Reconstructionists, particularly in African-American literature, their whole agenda was against the Black arts position. They wanted nothing to do with politics. They wanted politics, or what Gates called, quote unquote, mau-mauing out of African-American literature. And that's what they essentially did. But what's fascinating too, Jared, is that social movements put a lot of pressure on people. So the rumor that I've heard is that Gates is now putting together a documentary on the Black arts movement. And it's fun. It's amazing how social movements can change people's perspectives. I'm not sure that if that's actually the case that he's doing this film, I'm not sure that that happens without Ferguson. And I think what else is interesting is that people like you and I, who are always thinking about politics, we kind of never lose sight of the political horizon, and we always think about what's possible. And in that thinking about what's possible, we also think about the most horrible outcomes. But sometimes I think people who don't think about politics or tend not to want to think about politics will, in moments where we're at a kind of, in moments where we're not on our heels or in a kind of political retreat, they oftentimes forget about what's actually possible on the horizon. And so, like, you know, people were blindsided by Trump, but people on the left are like, well, actually, you know, we need to be pushing during moments where we have a Black person in office. We need to be pushing a Black person to be more progressive. And so I think that's kind of the way things tend to play out. And I think what happened with the Black Arts Movement is that they were never willing to abandon politics. And so they always thought very clearly about it, but also thought that it was an important part of the conversation. But there are others who would like us to not talk about politics, and those people get us into dangerous places. Particularly during moments where people think we're in the clear, and we've gotten beyond a kind of general conservatism. But this is the other piece about it, is that willingness to not think about politics is a conservative position. And this is what somebody like Ngugi wrote about in Writers in Politics, right? Very early on. It's like, if you don't have a political agenda, that means you're coinciding with the status quo, right? And so I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at in the last chapter, and also trying to really undermine this kind of argument that, okay, the Black arts movement was sexist and therefore it's not worthy of study. I mean, that's, to me, is a kind of bogus argument. And I think actually scholars will do good if we study the things that have contradictions, because that's how we can learn and see how things move forward. That was really roundabout. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, it was a great answer. I mean, first of all, you specifically lay out how Hoyt Fuller worked with, collaborated with, supported the endeavors of and careers of many women,
right.
just as part of the example, and demonstrate to a certain extent that, I mean, that there really wasn't any basis upon which Gates or anyone else could make this claim specifically of Fuller, but it's also absurd just on its face if people just step back for a second. I mean, to suggest that misogyny or exaggerated manhood doesn't exist in liberal American democracy, or
absolutely.
I mean, or anywhere else. I mean,
right.
It's just ridiculous. But I think. But real quick, I just wanted before I forget, when I hear you saying that Gates is going to be making a documentary about the Black Arts Movement, to me that seems to be perfectly consistent with as you outline of his career, sort of a culmination of that endeavor. It's like a lot of his popular commercial or cultural fare is seen often in response to potentially radical phenomena in society. So even with Wonders of the African World, it seemed to come at the sort of the peak of Afrocentricity in pop culture, and just sort of walking that back a little bit, from the radical edge. And then even up with the Reconstruction documentary, his stuff about Afro-Latin America, I mean, all seem, maybe it's just, again, me projecting, but seem to be riding an ebb that of a tide created by social movements in a way to blunt them. And then here he's going to come now as having one, as you point out, has looked to evade and totally replace and omit Hoyt Fuller, and that whole wing of history from discussion is now going to give us the culminating popular documentary on the history in a moment, of course, when Amiri Baraka's dead and can't defend himself anymore.
Right.
And many others have gone on. Here comes Gates to do what I can't imagine is going to do us any favors in terms of that history. Anyway, go ahead.
I think you're right. I mean, I think you have a point. I think you're right. I think I agree with you, and I hear the point, and it's something I have to really consider. And I think what I think we need to do is kind of not just think through the role that Gates plays, but also the foundations that are behind Gates. Because I think there's always going to be, and this is what I'm trying to also get at in the book, is that there's always going to be more conservative or more people who just really believe in liberalism in African American communities. And I guess our challenge is, like, how do you deal with the moments when those people are going to be handpicked to do certain things? And so I agree with you that there's a critique to be made of Gates, and this is a kind of a this is something that he's done before. But also, I want us to also not lose sight of the larger question: is like, what are the forces, or who are the people that empower somebody like Henry Louis Gates? And if we can answer that question about the people behind him at the same time as paying attention to him, I think we'll be onto something. And I think that's sometimes what we fail to do, is we know that there's something there, but we don't name it,
Well, as you point out again, and I'll remind everybody that you so rightly say that we have to remain aware of genuine connections to transnational power struggles. And I think that you are right. And I've only meant ever to talk about Gates or any other individual as a symbolic representation of that power. So in essence, my point that they're deployed and given that platform by these foundations and big media, which is where I want to sort of turn to move to a close here. To give them that room and platform to do this kind of work, and to negate the, for instance, the work of Fuller, and I would even, I started to say it as a joke, but I don't know that it really is. I mean, to even negate the knowledge that your work is coming, that your book is coming, and others like it exist or are coming. Gates and others are intellectuals, or academics. They follow what's going on. They read the work. I'm not saying, so they know what's going on. And as you even talk about, and I think it was fascinating, maybe we should, maybe I did want to talk about that. I mean, you even talk about, not to put him in this, we can move away from Gates now, but to even, even talk about the history of, and I was so glad that you included this, actually, that you even talk about the counterintelligence program and the surveillance of the state, its attempt to influence pop culture and literature. That the state was reading Black authors and looking to and even promote Black authors. So there is this over documented history of the attempt to do what I'm suggesting is happening, or whatever in other spaces. So let me let you say something about that, and then I do just want to take up a few more minutes of your time to ask you one more question, and then move very quickly to something about Dr. Turner, and then we can wrap up there. But please, if you would say something about any of the thing that I've just said, or this surveillance, or this attempt to manage popular discussion of Black art and politics, Blackness itself.
Absolutely. And just so you know, man, I'm not in a rush, so we could be here all day. I love talking about ideas, man. So we could do this all day. But look, man, I think, so one thing I want to backtrack a little bit. I think we have to really come to terms with the fact that people really believe in the positions they hold. I think us oftentimes assume that there's a puppeteer, but in fact, I think Gates really believes he's a liberal. He's a liberal through and through, and he really believes in that position. And so his belief in that position is what allows the people behind him to always be able to come to him to make certain productions. And it's not that he sees himself working for somebody else. It's the fact that he believes in the things that he's saying. And I think, the same thing. This is why I tried to also bring the state in throughout the book as well, because I think the state, they oftentimes fall out of the conversation when people talk about Black arts. But the state also believes that this stuff can potentially be a threat. So they're constantly, gathering information. They're constantly reading this stuff and keeping files on people just in case they ever get a chance to have a case, And they genuinely believe that they take Black arts people, but also the Black left at their word, that people want a revolution, that people want radical change. And that's threatening. And so they genuinely believe in that. And so they're going to use their resources to make sure that that doesn't happen. And I think, I mean, this is a fascinating thing, is it feels to me in some ways that oftentimes it's the left who doesn't believe what they're arguing. It's not that other people don't take them seriously. It's that I mean, I'm not sure we're convinced by our own arguments, which is another conversation. I don't know if I want to open up that can of worms, but like, people really believe in the things that in the positions that they take. And I think we have to take people at face value, right? That, there's no puppeteer behind Henry Louis Gates. He believes in the production that he's doing. He believes it's a greater value to society. I mean, the same thing with Hillary Clinton. People are like, there's a lot of people who say, Hillary just seems so fake, this and that. But Hillary really believes in a kind of centrist liberal democracy. Like, that's her true political beliefs. And so I think we have to be clear in all of that, in that people have these values, they believe in them, and they act upon them. And based on that, there are certain times when they align with certain people, and there are also times when they obviously that they don't align with people, and they are working in opposition to people. And so I think that's kind of our challenge, is to just take people at their word.
No. In fact, and I'm sorry, forgive me if I'm cutting you off, but we'll come right back to you on this. But this is a point to which I'm always, referring, that I agree with you, and I'm not. That's why I'm saying I'm not trying to suggest that Gates or anyone else is being puppeteered in that way. In fact, quite the opposite. And a line, I was just looking it up, that to quote, that I quote all the time, from Francis Stoner Saunders' The Cultural Cold War, which is a book I think I just think is, every day that goes by, I think the book becomes more important. But she's quoting somebody who was talking about how the international apparatus between MI6 and the CIA was working to develop a cultural, again, the cultural Cold War, a popular cultural argument using arts and pop culture to promote American capitalism and democracy. In fact, so one of the people they quote here says, they say, quote, "It was not a matter of buying off and subverting individual writers and scholars, but of setting up an arbitrary and factitious system of values by which academic personnel were advanced, magazine editors appointed, scholars subsidized and published, not necessarily on their merits, though these were sometimes considerable, but because of their allegiance." So I agree with you that even more to your point, that the more the person believes sincerely in their politics, the more likely they are, if they are skilled. And I don't think Gates is dumb or without skill or talent. So the more he believes in those politics, it makes even more sense that his rise would be that much more supported. And that's the point I'm trying to make. And I feel the same way about entertainers and anyone, any one of us, anybody for that matter, can fall into it. Yeah, but anyway, please go ahead.
No, but the other thing, Jared, is it also points to, and this is something Adolph Reed mentioned to me a while ago. He's like, it also points to the fact that sometimes those of us who see ourselves on the left don't realize how narrow our conversations have become and how few people are a part of it, right? Because, I mean, obviously the ideas of the ruling class are going to be the ruling ideas of the day. But I think sometimes when we get so deep on the left that we forget the fact that most people are not having these conversations, aren't privy to them. And when you bring somebody who's more centrist along, who makes some sense, people are going to gravitate towards it because they've not been introduced to something broader. And I think that's part of the story of Hoyt Fuller as well, is that this is a guy who's introducing these like left ideas, Black left ideas, right? Because he's not necessarily a Marxist per se, but he is open to critiques of capitalism. Right, but he's bringing these ideas to a popular audience, and I think that's also the threat that he represented the most. Is that he enriched Black counter-public discourse in a way that people hadn't done for generations, and we haven't seen anything like it since in terms of a print journal. I mean, I think the closest thing might arguably be the Black Scholar, But and then we can talk about your show as one of those things that did that. Because I remember being in Virginia listening to the show all the time, right? But in fact, we've seen that this kind of more left kind of Black counterpublic has been emaciated and devastated over the last 30 plus years, and as a result, we also see like our conversation in terms of politics has shrunk tremendously, and
No,
so
I agree.
that's kind.
And as much as I appreciate you including us in that, in those examples, one of the problems that I think, and this is definitely what I would love to ask you about, and so I'll do it now, is that is to compare media environments and times between now and when Fuller came up, because your book opens with a discussion of Fuller, again, sort of the Black militant kabuki theater, of working from literally within the Johnson publishing company, but inspiring, creating, fanning, an outside agitating public display to push his own publication more to the left, to do more in a aggressively left move to support movement. But one of the things that I think has been brilliant in the political, what our political opponents work, is the creation of this current media environment that I think does not allow for that anymore. That
I agree.
The Negro Digest and those other publications had a hold of a Black public sphere in a way that I don't think any of us could hope at this point. It's too atomized. There's too much production, too many people saying too many different things in too many different spaces for for anything to really take hold. And then there's that dominant overlay of commercial media with its own Black presence, scripted, and as you said, pedigreed, that limits discussion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think is, buttressed by a media system that does the same thing. So I did want to ask you about a little bit about the differences, or what you see as the potentials in this media environment for Hoyt Fuller style work to take hold.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot of changes that happen between the 1970s and now. Even I was reading yesterday something about like Black public intellectuals, and I think that's part of our contemporary kind of problems as well. What Hoyt Fuller attempted to do was always to show a debate, right? So he would, not that he took a position on things, but he would always attempt to show that there were various positions on things. And that gave the reader an opportunity to read all the positions and find where they stood in the debate. And oftentimes, I think, particularly for those of us who consider ourselves on the left, we since we are like, not that we're afraid of debate, but there's a part of us that doesn't believe that our ideas can stand up on their own against others. So we only talk about them with people who have similar ideas, right? And so I think part of what's missing is like the willingness to debate things in public. And by that, I mean like actually debate substantive ideas. I don't mean the kinds of debates where it's like, people coming at people over their, like, I don't mean like the Michael Eric Dyson kind of attack on Cornell West, because that wasn't a debate about substance, right? I actually mean a debate about substance, about people's values, people's politics, what they actually believe in, and what kind of world they want to see. And that's, I think, what Hoyt Fuller was really good at, is creating a space for debate, but then also allowing the ideas to actually take hold of the day and people to be moved by what they was best in the ideas. I think right now it's a kind of anti-intellectual culture, particularly in these digital spaces. People, one, they don't like debate. What they like to do is just trash people, which is different than debating ideas. And then two, I think that when people don't agree, oftentimes they don't want to even be in the same places, right? So you and I, when we were like, cutting our teeth and studying, like part of what we were raised on was these like CDs and tapes where people were just debating each other, like in the same space, debating ideas, Clark versus this person, and that's how it was. Stokely Carmichael versus this person, right? But now we live in a moment where people, if they don't agree, they don't inhabit the same space. Like, it's just like, we're not supposed to be at the same conferences, the same places. And I think that's part of the problem too, because what it does is you cultivate this audience of people who agree with you, but you're never pushed to actually defend your ideas with people who don't agree with you. And that's, I think, somewhat a change in not only like the Black counterpublic, but also a change in academia. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. These new spaces are much different than the spaces of the 1970s, and I'm not sure how we get to a more robust conversation. And also, man, like, this is something I really appreciate from you, and I'm not saying this simply because I'm on the show, but like, there is something really valuable in having substantive criticism and critiquing and disagreeing with somebody and being open and okay with that and walking away from it. And I think that's one of the things that we've also gotten away from. You can't criticize people anymore in public. And if you do, it's like there has to be a hidden agenda. But that's one thing you've always done on the show, is like, nothing was hidden. You criticize people on the weight of their ideas and why you disagree with their ideas. And I think in doing that, you show people can coexist even though they don't all agree, but also that there's a kind of value in critically thinking about what somebody has had to say. And I think those are the things that we're kind of missing in the era that we live in now. It's quite sad. And then you add to that equation, Jared, all the talking heads in the media who all come in with a position. They all get the talking points for the day. And also they happen to be Black. So they in some ways represent the Black position to everybody. And you just like are in it's like a perfect storm of bullshit, for lack of better words.
Sometimes that is the perfect word. By the way, when you just see the salaries that people are paid to be that pundit on commercial TV, I mean, there's a definite class divide.
Absolutely.
I mean, my goodness. It would be,
absolutely.
And I always joke, I've never seen that many zeros behind my name, so I don't know how I would act. But
yeah,
I can't imagine. My goodness. Anyway, I made the joke, or I made the point about time, and you said you had plenty. The issue is me, so I'll admit the issue is unfortunately on me. So I appreciate
all good,
and I will happily do this again. There's so many, I think, important points that you raised, and I just think it is a shame that people, man. If we could, one day, I would love to do I keep joking, like I want to do a lost tapes on all of the background discussions I've had over the years with people who have, who about why they don't want to have a public disagreement with someone. I mean, it's a fascinating, almost, sociological endeavor on its own. I mean, it's like a study of its own. I mean, it's I mean, but it's just a lot. Anyway.
But Jared, really quick though, the piece about that is also people wanting to appear as if they had the right line on everything. And that doesn't actually give people an opportunity to grow. Like, we don't have to have the right line on everything. I can be wrong. Jared, I can be wrong in the 2008 elections. And by 2009, 2010, know that I have to have a different position. And that's okay. That's called growth. You know what I mean?
No, I hear you. I hear you. But yeah, part of it is that. I think part of it is also people have been frank and saying, I don't want to be seen as publicly disagreeing with somebody else because that person is politically or popularity wise situated in such a way.
Right.
I don't want to, threaten my own brand or career. I mean, that's been a lot.
Right.
That's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of it too. So that's why when you said earlier that people don't necessarily believe their own publicly stated political beliefs, that part resonated with me just on that alone. Because I'm saying, if you really believe what you claim in your writing or in your work or in your public speaking, then why wouldn't you be willing to take a stance against someone else's clearly oppositional views, without it? I mean, again, like you said, it doesn't have to degenerate into, we're not name calling, we're not talking about, I mean, anyway, I mean, so I don't, but there's a lot of that. There's just a lot of that as people, there's a lot of career checking. I think people who aren't familiar with academia think that we're a lot freer than we are. I think, in case I definitely think they think we're more well paid than we are.
Mhm.
But a lot of people will just, there's a lot of concern over careers and positions and relationships.
Mhm.
I mean, it's a
Mhm.
wild, it's wild. It's very, or all the
Yeah.
times people have told me, don't say that, or don't interview
Yeah.
that person because it will hurt your
Yeah.
career. In fact,
Yeah.
I've already said this publicly. Dyson said that to one of my colleagues. It said that I'm trying to tell Dr. Ball how to not become a marginal nationalist professor at an HBCU. That's almost a direct quote.
Right.
So, I mean,
Wow.
there is this concern, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, so I do want to quickly turn to two more quick topic areas that themselves, of course, deserve much more time. But
Mhm.
one of is again Ferguson. I mean, you know, not only an academic, but you are also an activist. You engaged in the community. You were in the streets in Ferguson when everything was popping off. You obviously are still in the community in that area. And I just wanted to ask you, just broadly speaking, if there's anything you would want to share with us about what maybe we popularly understand incorrectly, or maybe update us on what's really going on as Ferguson has dropped off the headlines. Anything really. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to enlighten us a little bit, given your particular situation.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of things. Two things come to mind right away. The first thing is that, you know, Ferguson allowed me to understand spontaneous uprisings a lot better. Um, you know, I've always studied social movements, so I always really wanted to be a part. I wanted to better understand them, but they're a tricky thing. And like, you know, spontaneous social uprisings are essentially chaos. You know, and I think we oftentimes write about them as if they're not, but they are chaos. And what anybody who's like close to them and attempting to work with them is trying to do is to organize and make some order out of the chaos and give it some political direction. Um, and so that's one of the main things that I really learned in Ferguson is like, okay, you know, this is a moment of chaos, and and what we can do is try to organize it and give it some political direction so that it can open up some space for us to exist, and, you know, free us from certain restrictions that have been put on us by the state and by the private sector, so forth and so on. The other thing, though, I think that we really have to deal with, and, you know, I'm late coming to this, but people have said it before, is really trying to understand the nonprofit sector, because I think not very much has changed in Ferguson, but what has changed and what I've been able to witness is that a whole lot of nonprofits have not only swooped in, but started up, but, you know, people have benefited who worked in that sector, but that doesn't necessarily impact the people who live in the community that was at the heart of everything. And so, as I think those of us who are interested in kind of a radical future, we have to really think about what this nonprofit industry does to social movement energy, but also to spontaneous uprisings, because the nonprofit sector is an essential part of contemporary capitalism. And if we leave things to the nonprofit sector, we'll basically go back to the status quo, which is essentially what we've done. And this is, you know, not a knock against a lot of good people who work in nonprofit sector, but that entity in of itself is terrible for social movements. It just is.
I'll
And
just
it's hard
quickly
to,
add a
yeah,
quote from your book, because I
yeah.
just want to remind folks, you actually address some of this as a question. If I have this correct, you say at one
Mm-hmm.
point, meanwhile, institutional incorporation is often understood as a victory or sign of progress, as pre-existing
Mm-hmm.
incorporate portions of social movement agendas. Those within the movement and scholars who study movements often point to this incorporation as an example of how the liberal establishment is forced to come to grips with social movement critiques and make room for new ideas. Um, uh, uh, of course. Anyway, my point is that you try to you address this question of in the section maintenance, reconstruction, and demolition in the coda.
Mm-hmm.
This question of co-optation of movements,
Mm-hmm.
institutionalization of movements, to some
Mm-hmm.
extent. I think I got that somewhat correct. But please go ahead.
Yeah,
Correct.
absolutely. I mean, so I think you're totally right. I think
And I'm sorry,
in
this is the
writing this,
line I was looking for. I'm sorry, this my bad. This is the
go
line
ahead, you got it, go ahead.
you say both repression and incorporation result in the demobilization of activists. End quote. That was the
Absolutely.
line, the point I was looking for. Anyway, please go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, you're right, because I think this book, even though it's not about Ferguson, is actually all about Ferguson in some ways, because of what experiencing or the experiences working through Ferguson allowed me to understand is a social movement environment. And it's the same kind of environment you saw during Black Power. I mean, where it's basically uprisings happening all around the country. Race is on the forefront of the conversation. There's there's like a unspoken kind of connection to kind of nationalist ideas that are emanating, right? And so the book is, in a lot of ways, about Ferguson as well. And I think we have to really understand incorporation. Incorporation is sometimes more powerful than what I refer to as demolition when we talk about the COINTELPRO and things like that. Because incorporation is much more sinister and it takes longer to figure out. When you murder Fred Hampton at in the night, in the evening, that's something that a lot of people will kind of understand immediately and get the gravitas of that. But when you slowly incorporate something over time, things are moving and changing and you don't realize where it's headed. And I think that's something we really have to study, is just incorporation. And the state is really, really good at it. Particularly the US is really good at it. And I think we haven't done enough study of that in terms of how we study social movements. Yeah.
Oh no, that's in and I mean I quote it all the time, that line from Fanon, that the goal isn't in a colonial context isn't to destroy the culture of the colonized. It's to hold it, as he says, in a mummified form that testifies against its own membership. So when you talk about the sinister nature of it, I mean, that's of course what it is. And that's how I view, in fact, when I'm talking about the particular product of a Henry Louis Gates or something else, that's what I'm saying, that we're automatically drawn to it because it's going to be well produced and it's going to have all the labeling and all the accoutrement or whatever. It's going to have all of that draped on it. And we're going to be like, yes. And it's going to have some quote probably from Baraka or probably from people that he has explicitly hated. I mean, viciously spoken, just very ugly things about. And it's going to draw us to it, but it's going to be something very much not what we need or even are looking for. But anyway,
I mean, this is Black Panther, right? This is Black Panther. This is the film Black Panther, right? I mean, this is exactly what it is. And we end up, cheering for the state and the guy who works with the CIA agent, to kill another Black person. Like, I'm not saying, the guy didn't have. Sorry, this is a whole other thing. Go ahead.
I know, man, and I look. We just, again, I would just do another one at another point, but I do have to ask you, somewhat quickly to talk a little bit about the gathering where we did last see each other at the Africana Studies and Research Center and the commemoration of James Turner. We both studied under him. We, both, been inspired by him. You, of course, contributed greatly to Scott Brown's book on Dr. Turner. I don't know. How does that experience or that commemoration or that tradition relate to what we've been talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that tradition is the thing that birthed you and I, and that's one of the greatest joys of my life, is to be able to say that I'm a part of that tradition. And I think the other thing is that Dr. Turner, James Turner, is a reminder of just do the work, play your part, you don't have to beat your chest about it. Just do good work. And ultimately that work will kind of stand the test of time and people will come to appreciate it. At a certain point, it may not be right when you do it right away, but over time it'll be appreciated. You look at this kind of global turn in Black studies, how everybody is thinking globally, diasporically. That's something he was doing so early on. And now it's if you're not doing that, you're not in tune. But, most people don't even give him much credit in being one of the persons who advocated for that position, that kind of global outlook. And so I think he's like a really good reminder. It's like, it's not about fame. It's not about, being the person who has the most awards and accolades. It's just about doing good work and putting out ideas that'll stand the test of time. But then at the same time, it's also about leveraging the kind of resources that you have to advance, Black people's struggles. And he's done that. His track record is amazing in that regard. And I think there's so much more that we're all learning about him, even in this late stage of his life, that we didn't know. And there'll be so much more for us to learn, moving forward. But he's like a great example, man. I mean,
the one thing I forgot to bring up when we were all up there is something he once said to us, one of those group conversations we all, used to, hunger for, where he were talking about the relationship of money to the movement. And he said he felt that his generation made a mistake in their, obviously not their critique of capital and capitalism, but in the sort of the, immediate rejection of money or the accumulation of any money at all. And he said, and he concluded by saying the line was, the issue isn't can you earn $100,000, it's whether you can earn 100,000 but live off of 30. And obviously his point was, and I think is emblematic in his example in his life, and I don't know the details of his finances, but just in the way he moved with his life, he seemed to really live that way, that he would earn 100 but give away 70. Or share 70, or because even as all of us were talking about all the time he gave us, his kids got up there and said, but he also gave us all the time we needed too.
Right. So that was like, crazy. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it was real crazy.
Yeah.
In fact, because I remember being at another conference where another more well-published scholar got up there accepting an accolade for his publishing and had to apologize to his family, who were in the front row, for not giving them the time and publishing all those works. And I just was thinking, Turner, who's often criticized for not publishing enough, which you all have proven is not necessarily the case either, was giving of himself to every other aspect of the movement, that everybody, while he was not famous, everybody knew him and nobody had a bad word to say. And he was seemingly very giving. So anyway, but anyway, that just occurred to me. Anyway, just as you were talking there, that I forgot that story. But it seemed.
Yeah, but this is another part of it too, Jared. Is that like he was a teacher. Like he taught us. I mean, the thing that's fascinating is, like, particularly in this moment where everyone wants to be a public intellectual, no one actually talks about the teaching aspect of our job, which is probably the most important part, the part where we touch the most people. And I think it's great to publish, and I think we should all strive to publish stuff, as Dr. Turner did, right? And he actually, when he published things, he wanted it to always be towards a broader Black popular audience, which is why so many scholars overlooked his writing. But it's also very important to just teach and spend time with people and cultivate people at a human level, in terms of like the human element of like the academia that oftentimes we underappreciate. And I think that's also the brilliance of Dr. Turner. I mean, it's amazing that every single person who's ever taken a class with him has a personal story of connection and how he somehow sparked their thinking in this way. And I talk to, we got colleagues all over at every university, and all of them can't say the same thing about their mentor or somebody who they studied with. A lot of times students, they graduate from these PhD programs and they hated their program. But I think that's one of the testaments to him too, is to a reminder that the Black studies tradition, teaching is at the core of that tradition, right? As is sacrifice and commitment and all these other things.
Well, Dr. Jonathan Fenderson, we're going to have to wrap it up there for now, but I greatly appreciate you taking the time to join us. The new book, again, is Building the Black Arts Movement, Hoyt Fuller and the Cultural Politics of the 1960s. As everybody gets to see, they see now why I've been pressing you for so long to come on with us. It's been a great conversation, man. Thank you very much for the work, for the book, and for taking the time. And we'll catch up with you very soon, I'm sure.
Jared, I appreciate you having me, man. I'm a big fan of your work, man. So just keep doing what you're doing, brother.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.